Okay. Hi seniors, today's lesson is going to be a really quick overview of the role that minorities played in journalism. They have a really long history in journalism, almost as long as the history of journalism in the United States itself. And while this is a really huge topic and we could spend a really long time talking about it, because we're going through the history of journalism in the United States, trying to get it all done in this week and a half, I need to go through it really quickly today. I'm just going to touch on some major points about the history of minorities in journalism, and then I'm going to attach some articles that you guys can read as well if you're interested in learning more about that. But basically, I'm going to start with African American press. Racism and discrimination obviously existed in the U.S. kind of since its foundation, but that didn't stop Black people from wanting their voices to be heard. It didn't stop them from starting their own newspapers, starting their own publishing, getting their voice out there. Because the United States was a free society, especially in the Northeast regions, African Americans, while they were heavily discriminated against and while segregation and racism was really, really prominent in the society, they weren't prevented from starting their own organizations. They were able to start up newspapers, they were able to start up publications, they were able to use journalism as an outlet to get their voices out and to express themselves, and they were able to speak for themselves instead of having to have white people speak for them or on their behalf. And that was actually one of the main reasons that John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish started their first African-American newspaper, which was the Freedom's Journal. It was founded in 1827 in March, and they started it for just what I just said. They wanted to be able to express their own opinions. They wanted to be their own voice. They didn't want to have to rely on other people to speak for them and to speak for their needs. They wanted to express themselves. And so they started this newspaper. They started printing, using Freedom's Journal to express themselves, to express issues that were prominent in the African American society at the time, to talk about Black issues, Black voices, Black society, Black culture, what was happening in the U.S. in terms of the development of African American communities. That was really the main goal of the very first African American journal, the Freedom's Journal. And then from there, African American run newspapers ran really prominent in the U.S., especially in the time of segregation when African American writers wouldn't have been able to write for other newspapers. They were able to join Black newspapers, which had just as high circulation and were able to reach just as many people. And then if we're thinking way back to the time of slavery, this was around the time in the 1800s that some of the African American journals got started and started spreading really widely in the U.S. And this was a way that people could communicate information about like through code about the Underground Railroad. They were able to talk about stuff going on in the Civil War. They were able to talk about just different issues going on within the Black community. That was also a source of hope for people who were still stuck in slavery or people who were fighting in the war. They were able to read these journals and they were able to see the way that things really were getting better. And there was kind of a source of hope there through these news outlets, through journals like Freedom's Journal. So that's where African American press is really important, and its origins were 1827, so pretty early on in U.S. history, and then they continued for a while through racism, through segregation, until discrimination that was legal was illegalized, and so there was no longer a need for specific race-based organizations like a specific Black newspaper or a specifically white newspaper. There wasn't that need anymore, but it lasted for at least 150 years in the United States where Black writers wrote from their own perspective. They were able to have their own publications, get their voices out there, which is really huge. One of the most important Black writers that we have learned about is Ida B. Wells. She was a huge muckraker, and she exposed a ton of stuff during the Progressive era through her journalism and through her writing. And so, yeah, that's just a little bit of history on African Americans in journalism, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign language newspapers. Obviously, in the 19th century, early 1900s, there was a huge influx of immigration into the United States, and this led to an increase in newspapers that were written in other languages because a lot of the immigrants that came into the United States did not speak English, and they still needed a way to communicate their news, their social issues, their opinions, stuff like that. So a couple that I want to talk about. Yiddish newspapers appeared for New York Jews in the East Coast, and they would use this to introduce people who were coming into America on the East Coast to kind of the culture of the United States, what was going on. Wanted to use the newspaper to kind of introduce people coming in, use it as a way to get them used to the culture, to talk about issues that they could be expecting, talk about what was going on at the time. So it was really a way to educate immigrants coming in, especially if they were of Jewish descent, on what to expect moving into the United States. So obviously that was a hugely needed resource for immigrants coming into the United States, and journalism was the main platform that they were able to use to express that information to immigrants in a really widespread way. And then there were also a lot of foreign newspapers in some of the Midwest states, which were founded by a lot of like Czechoslovakian, German, Danish people who came in, and they started their own kind of network of newspapers in order to just have their own economic cultural, societal contributions, where it was in their own language, they understood what was going on, and they were able to talk about issues that they were facing living in the United States in a way that they could all understand and relate to. So that's just a little bit of history of foreign language newspapers. There are still foreign language newspapers that exist in the United States. There's actually a lot of them. A lot of them are based out of some of the more major cities like New York City or like Chicago, and I'll post links to some of those as well if you guys are interested in foreign language newspapers. But that was a huge population that started out as immigration rose in the early 1900s, and that remains today still in some ways where it's necessary in order to make sure that news is available to everyone. That's something that we've seen a lot through freedom of the press, through the penny press, through things like African American press and foreign language newspapers, is that it is a right, if you are an American citizen, to receive American news. That is like a right that you should have. If you live in the United States, you should be able to understand what is going on in the U.S. There shouldn't be anything like a language barrier or societal barrier or socioeconomic barrier preventing you from getting that information. And that is something that we see minorities in the history of the United States journalism really fighting for. They're really progressive, really fighting for equal access to information for everyone, really making sure that that's out there. So that's just a little bit about the history of minorities in journalism in the U.S. I wanted to touch on that. I know that was really brief, but I am going to put links to some more information if you guys are interested in that. And then just a heads up for you, tomorrow we're going to start moving into modern journalism. We're going to start talking about the role that television and social media and the internet has played in journalism, and then go into modern issues in journalism. So I am going to keep posting 2 to 3 assignments a week for those of you who are interested in that. For those of you who expressly said that you want to work on a paper or a project, tomorrow I will post a paper prompt for you to start working on. It's going to be about the same thing. It's going to be about modern issues in journalism, but then you have one project to work on the next 2 weeks instead of 2 or 3 smaller assignments a week. So it's up to you how you want to break up your workload. As always, please review the slides every day. Even if you don't have an assignment, I still want you to access that information. I still want it to be fresh to you. I still want you to do the reading, even if I'm not giving you an assignment associated with it, just because this is stuff that's going to be useful on upcoming quizzes and on the assignments and papers and stuff like that. So make sure you're staying up to date with the information. Don't let yourself get behind. Let me know if you need an extension or anything, if you need help with anything. Make sure that you are also taking care of yourself. I hope you're spending time outside. I hope you're spending time usefully and not just sitting around watching TV. I hope you're making the most of this quarantine. I know it sucks, but we're all kind of in this together. So I'm here if you need anything. Yeah, have a good Monday.